For a lot of people, this particular sequence of video and audio holds a lot of nostalgia. It might have awoken some memories that they haven't thought of or known they had for many years. Personally, while my memory and experience with it is slightly different, slightly older shows being swapped in, the feelings and memories are very much the same. Seeing this sequence is still enough to stir up memories within myself and take me back to when I was a kid in my room pretending to be asleep, watching cartoons because I'm not exactly tired, or being a bit bummed out that I couldn't watch whichever cartoon I was obsessing over at the time, because this was Adult Swim. No kids allowed. Except of course, I was still watching. I was just enjoying it less than I probably should have. Today, I'd probably enjoy the Adult Swim shows more, and as I've gone back and watched some of them, I have. But then I was just a kid and didn't understand half the jokes being told. Today, I love King of the Hill. Then, I was bored out of my mind in waiting for Family Guy or Futurama to come on. Today, the channel is dedicated to curating animated content for its adult audience that seems to enjoy a specific, non-conformist form of comedy, parody, and live-action animated series. Don't ask Adult Swim what sort of animated content it wants to capitalize on, because there's no right answer. The primetime and late-night programming block by Cartoon Network seems to do its own thing. From recycling some beloved cartoon characters from the 60s to designing modern forms of critical commentary in its mockumentaries and sketch comedies. It knows what it's doing. In its truest form, Adult Swim is the surrealist impression of animation that was largely missing from basic cable channels. As the channel has evolved into a separate entity from Cartoon Network, it had also started to roll out live-action content that may or may not be inspired by its classic cartoon characters or animated shows. For instance, the Eric Andre show is eerily reminiscent of Space Ghost Coast to Coast.
Get out of here, you fat bitch!
But Adult Swim's origins are as astounding as its reputation today.
Hey, Barbaroni!
More than 3 decades ago, the narrative building around cartoons and their viewership was simplistic, carefully curated, and frankly speaking, quite bubblegum. After all, the target audience hadn't had its coming-of-age arc yet. Allegedly, cartoons were for kids, and cable networks like Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel had no trouble in pushing that now, hopefully outdated, narrative. Their content, animated or otherwise, was centralized around kids who will definitely tune in after doing their homework while their parents are at work, or whenever their parents just need a break. To be fair, such trends in targeted viewership and demographics were largely under-researched. Adults knew that they had to distract their toddlers from throwing a tantrum before they'd sipped their morning coffee, and, well, cartoons help to avoid such tricky situations. That's about it. But of course, the change in the status quo was imminent. Cable networks like Adult Swim, which have magically thrived for more than 20 years, were nothing short of revolutionary. Think cartoons' only purpose was to help avoid tantrums and for some post-homework entertainment? Think again. In 1989, something extraordinary happened. With the release of The Simpsons, the targeted demographic for cartoon viewership changed forever. Rather than as a cartoon or mere animation, the show was marketed as an animated sitcom, and it definitely catered more towards adults than kids. In this satirical depiction of everyday American life in the depths of its culture, adults found a new clear-cut genre on TV. They were interacting with characters rooted in problems similar to theirs, and, well, the long desire to indulge in cartoons was also largely fulfilled. The success of The Simpsons showed cartoon cable networks that even adults would watch cartoons if you made them interesting or entertaining enough. In other words, adults were definitely in line to consume animation that transcended the recycled, simplistic, childish plotlines that were getting profoundly predictable. Cartoon Network itself launched October 1st of 1992. It was the first 24-hour-a-day network running completely off of animation. And while The Moxie Show, a 3D animated series, is technically the first original programming run on the show, with the channel previously relying on Hanna-Barbera and Warner Bros. Cartoons, Space Ghost Coast to Coast is widely considered to be Cartoon Network's first fully produced series. You see, since The Simpsons had blown up and the adult animation scene was beginning to be birthed, it wasn't long before they realized a channel based purely around animation can realistically only cater to children during the hours where they're awake. Otherwise, you're just kind of leaving money on the table. In short, Mike Lazo, Cartoon Network's first programmer, had a dream, the Hanna-Barbera library at his disposal, and an opportunity to revamp a cartoon character he admired as a child.
It's your favorite 60s superhero hosting
an intergalactic talk show.
Face it, Space Ghost!
No!
You're a spaceman that choked on a muffin!
That, sir, is impossible because I am allergic to muffins!
Space Ghost was recontextualized into an adult-themed animated talk show that didn't seem to follow the traditional rules of comedy. It felt spontaneous, it felt surreal, and above everything, the obtuse aesthetic of a cartoon character indulging in adult-themed interviews with actors and musicians was incredibly unique. What helped set the show apart was its timing. Lazo knew that there was a demographic that was obsessed with The Simpsons, and the same audience would want to watch an adult animated talk show with a chilled beer in their hands. Well, the show wasn't exactly for kids, so Space Ghost Coast to Coast used to air late at night when children were supposed to be sleeping. Interestingly, Cartoon Network was also following the common trend to air their cartoons at a time that was principally reserved for late night talk shows hosted by real people. All in all, it was an experiment. Would people tune in to watch a borderline forgotten cartoon character from the 60s hosting a subversive comedy talk show? Well, yeah. Space Ghost Coast to Coast was a huge success despite being a low-budget, voluntary project. Yep, Cartoon Network was tapping into an entirely new audience that seemed counterintuitive to their initial product. Back in time, the popular narrative barred adults from enjoying mainstream cartoons or other animated shows, but the network essentially had no money to reprogram a lot of its storylines. Their only back support was the MGM library, which had an absolute ton of characters to be reused and recycled. Yet Lazo's biggest win was how he had stirred up the genre to revitalize two very high-demand notions of media consumption of his time: talk shows and adult-themed animation. It was weird, risky conjecture, but it worked like a charm. Plus, Cartoon Network didn't have a ton to lose. After all, Space Ghost was a frugal project that was mainly relying on people's voluntary labor and creative discretion. Alongside the rise of The Simpsons, more and more animated shows emerged to cater to the 16+ audience. Notably, the marginal success of South Park, Futurama, and Family Guy showed that children were no longer the only targeted viewership. The adult audience was definitely tuning into cable channels like Cartoon Network to enjoy animated shows that they deemed worthy. Honestly, it makes sense. The same audience had grown up with limited options on their TV. Their TV diet largely consisted of cartoons and other animated programs, just like their parents had grown up with MTV. The only hiccup in their consumerism was quite clear-cut. Cartoons hadn't evolved from the childish tropes they regularly demonstrated and that were watched when they were younger. So now, when children went to bed, adults were in charge of the TV remote. And sure, they could have watched real-life late-night talk shows, but many were choosing to watch Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Viewership was sporadic. From Thursday late night to Saturday early mornings, adults were watching Cartoon Network in diverse time frames. While the channel was ecstatic that they had a brand new demographic to sell to their advertisers, varying time frames weren't fun. Because when do you know children stop watching Cartoon Network and adults take the seat? Surely, companies wouldn't like to advertise their cars to a demographic that was just learning how to bike at that age and time. That's a total waste of money. But if they were to somehow successfully tap into an audience who loves cars, can legally drive, and only cries for their mom when they stub their toe really bad or someone at work is mean, that's value for their money. Concentrating advertisements on a particular time frame was a huge driving force behind Adult Swim. This doesn't mean that Cartoon Network didn't test its creative waters before jumping onto the ship. Before Adult Swim became an official thing, it had its fair share of experiments in terms of what content was consumable and what wasn't. The channel began rolling out major chunks of action-adventure programming to cater to its aging audience. Shows like Pirates of Dark Water, Space Ghost, The Herculoids, and Thundar the Barbarian were the first-gen animated shows targeted towards the specific audience of Cartoon Network. Sure, these characters were being recontextualized, but the ingenuity of the plot lines and aesthetic earned the public approval. And for good. Since this formula had worked for the network, we'd see that in the years to come, more action-adventure programs would gain momentum in terms of viewership and mainstream popularity. Some notable examples like Sailor Moon, Voltron, Thundercats, Robotech Beast Wars, and more gave Cartoon Network an edge over competing cable companies at the time. All things considered, the channel was able to hold on to its adult demographic. Culturally speaking, it was very clear that on a basic level, the 16+ population group was steering away from the mindset that cartoons are just childish entertainment. Popular motifs from other sources of media were being incorporated into the cartoons they were watching. More popular genres of humor, touching on the political, social, and cultural context of America, were being added to the mix as well. All in all, comedy and animation were becoming digestible forms of criticism in society. Add a punch of dark, sexual, and unhinged humor, and boom. There you go. Not to mention, since Cartoon Network was using characters from the MGM library, people were watching some familiar faces. But what their character could or couldn't do had certainly evolved. Finally, we get to the programming block that consisted of shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law, C-Lab 2021, and The Brak Show. Oddly enough, Cartoon Network didn't even bother to market any of these shows. They just premiered unannounced. Really, these iconic shows just popped onto the TV out of nowhere, and their success redirected Lazo to make an entire separate programming block for his young adult and teen audience called Adult Swim. The rationale was quite simple: just split the TV time between two of their key demographics, the children and the 16+ folk. Of course, one driving force to make this decision was to maximize the return on advertisement, something we've already discussed. But whatever Lazo's motivations were to launch Adult Swim, we can't exactly ignore the sincerity in the gesture. You see, the head of the channel had fought long and hard to roll out original content for his new demographic. Despite limited resources, he knew the show had to go on. So to reserve the primetime and late night hours for the adult audience also meant that he had to step up his game, because previously Cartoon Network was just making a mix and match cocktail for its audience. Right after airing some bubblegum content for kids, you'd get Space Ghost making some hefty adult jokes.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
You.
And so, finally, in 2001, Lazo officially launched Adult Swim. Young adults and teens had their reserved hours for Saturday and Thursday nights. What really changed things for television was the marketing mechanisms for the channel. No, there weren't really any billboards or flyers. At best, the Space Ghost Coast to Coast panel at the San Diego Comic-Con handed out Adult Swim t-shirts and CDs containing theme songs to some upcoming shows on the channel. By all accounts, some pretty cool merch. It was the feeling of the channel's inherent exclusivity that became its instant magic trick to grab its audience. It felt like someone had cleared the entire bar just for you to dance till you drop. Cartoon Network was a big name, and the channel was foregoing its intended audience just to cater to your subversive tastes. Today, the block remains a cultural icon, but it is true that it's lost a hefty portion of its viewership to streaming platforms. A lot of people love Rick and Morty, yet the iconic show is more of an online phenomenon than a TV hit. So if we had to lay out the major difference between Adult Swim in the early 2000s and today, of course we'd have to talk about the internet. You may have heard of this internet once or twice. It's a great place to diversify your viewership options, something the channel co-opted pretty early. Plus, the high strangeness and vastness of the internet meant Adult Swim's genius had more exposure than ever. The way we look at it, Lazo's creation was something of a trendsetter that would continue to inspire many future online phenomena. You might not tune into Cartoon Network to watch a great piece of art, or you might, depending on what's on, but you can know that its authentic ingenuity is almost historic. But back in the 2000s, with where the internet was at, Adult Swim had a fairly unique advantage. First off, it didn't have to compete with streaming services, so the viewership was pretty consistent. And there's a huge underlying reason behind that. The rise of internet fame resulted in micro-level chatting options that were varied by different interests in pulp culture. These online communities were shaping up stan culture as we know it today, and their approach to the internet wasn't much different than ours. You had MySpace and other micro-level chatting platforms that allowed nerds and geeks to rant about their favorite shows, from everything they like about their obsession of the month to everything wrong with it. These online communities were excellent grounds to not only configure your demographic, but also to understand their expectations for the content you were rolling out. And Adult Swim took full advantage of that fan culture to curate its shows and plotlines. At times, the channel was known to just solicit information by joining these online communities and posing as a fan, and other instances called for more direct involvement from its audience as well. That's when Mike Lazo gave his fans more autonomy than was ever seen in mainstream TV. The creators were actively combining the feedback they were getting from fans to enhance user retention. In recent years, Adult Swim has taken a more upfront approach in asking, hey, you watch our programming block, which do you prefer to watch in the limited hours you get with us? The way the channel has evolved, the experimentation with content is more democratic than ever. Fans have decided the fate of shows like Apollo Gauntlet and Hot Streets. While these two series moved forward, Bad Guys and Trap Universe were limited to one-off pilots, essentially allowing fans to have more control over which shows get to take their TV time and the ones that need to be shelved forever. And that kind of stuff still exists to this day, which has gifted us genius shows like Smiling Friends. But fan engagement is more nuanced than simply deciding which show gets TV time and which doesn't. Adult Swim, unlike its competitors, was highly receptive to cultural changes that their audience was experiencing in real time. For instance, with the slow rise of anime culture in the US and its high market value, this led the channel to make anime its centerfold. Instead of deprioritizing a Japanese form of art, they embraced the changing tides of media consumption. There is essentially no spot for anime fans to watch anime, and Adult Swim gave them exactly that. In its early days, Cartoon Network was already airing Toonami, which honestly played a huge part in the mainstreamification of anime within the US. So, more or less, Lazo had reconfigured the popular media from Japan to cater to its own audience. Yet Toonami itself was fairly inconsistent at the time. During its run since 1997, it has come and gone several times throughout the years. But a more organized shift to anime content meant that Toonami could transition to partnering with Adult Swim. It was a no-brainer for Lazo. His fans wanted to watch anime in their own reserved time, and this block allowed that to happen. Adult Swim was also an expert in picking up canceled shows that had a ton of potential, even if their original distributor saw them as a liability or simply didn't trust the process. Since Adult Swim was lurking in the online communities and had a more robust sense of fan interaction, they knew what their audience was watching and loving, even if their favorites weren't being aired on their own channel. One notable example, of course, being Family Guy, which was cancelled by Fox after its third season. Can you imagine? Today it's one of Fox's crown jewels. It's right up there with The Simpsons, yet back in 2002 its low ratings led to its cancellation. That's when Adult Swim bought its rerun rights, and in the blink of an eye, Seth MacFarlane's creation became an instant hit for the block. But its entirely new fan base also greatly boosted DVD sales to break a bunch of records. The first 2 seasons of Family Guy sold more than 2 million DVDs. When Fox saw that a rival channel had so easily co-opted its show to appease its own fan base, it felt compelled to bring back the show for a 4th season in 2005. And all Adult Swim could really say was, yeah, you're welcome. This particular instance tells us that Adult Swim had a great affinity for recognizing the long-term potential of cult classics. Looking at you, Mission Hill. And the block was pretty okay with legitimizing its bold fusion of comedy that was bound to offend someone. We know that Family Guy has an inherent tendency to sexual commentary as its primary form of humor. Despite criticism, it dwells on provoking and offending everyone it can. It could be Stewie's sexual ambiguity or Peter's absolute cringe takes on, well, just about anything. The show is designed to stir controversy, and Adult Swim was pretty okay with that. Speaking of which, while we discuss the evolution of Adult Swim, it'd feel weird to not talk about its legacy of pushing for a more surreal form of humor. The sort of humor that transcends rationality to comment on the absurdity of a particular situation, or deliberately makes you uncomfortable because, well, our lives are hardly logical. Now, when we want to channel the illogicality of our lives, our resort is dank, dark memes. But yeah, Adult Swim did it first, or at least helped popularize it. It didn't want to appease human rationality because, hey, It's sometimes tiring to make sense of stuff. So how do you make peace with our very illogical reality? Well, you don't. You just gotta confront the reality that Adult Swim capitalizes on. Our universe can be inherently nonsensical, just like philosophical absurdism describes it. In response to the weirdness, you have shows like Rick and Morty, The Eric Andre Show, and Andre's new series, mostly for millennials, that stand steadfast in the face of irrationality. Sometimes making sense is overrated. Adult Swim's overarching acceptance of being weird and at times cringe is highly reflected in its creative process that's transgressive and experimental. It recognizes that, well, one man's cool could be another man's cringe. Again, Rick and Morty. So it's fine that the block had a pair of ass cheeks as the series' main character, or a meatball. And it's fine if Eric Andre destroys his own set before the show even starts. You don't have to make sense of why it happens, just know that it happens. And it's funny. Adult Swim's ingenuity lies in its sloppiness. It doesn't readily believe in perfecting its craft, unless you're talking the Venture Bros, which is perfection, but rather makes its entertainment in its original form. Its low-budget production plotlines tend to find humor in the unlikeliest of places. And, well, that seems to be an accurate representation for our own illogical real lives. Adult Swim's breakthrough of cringe was monumental in stirring up the long-standing debate on what exactly constitutes as funny, or where exactly are the lines between humor and cringe. Now, Adult Swim believes in giving back to its fans. With its streaming platforms, indie video games, and William Street Records label, the channel is more of a culture than a service. But its real legacy lies in giving space to the ultimate cringe and redefining lameness as the badge of honor. Throughout the years, Adult Swim has fearlessly embraced the weird, the surreal, the unconventional. It's been a sanctuary for those seeking a respite from traditional programming, offering a haven for creative minds to explore the depths of their imagination. With its divisive array of shows and a distinctive blend of humor, satire, and social commentary, Adult Swim has become a breeding ground for fresh talent and groundbreaking ideas. It's given us great characters like Rick and Morty, the Smiling Fringe, and the Venture Bros, and may have single-handedly saved and pushed forward the idea of adult animation. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next, support us on our Patreon if you like this content and want to see more like it, and of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.